What the heck is happening on the Strait of Hormuz? No, seriously, if you know, please tell the rest of us. Then maybe you could be on the opposite end of the line when viewers pick up the phone for another edition of the Geopolitics Helpline. What is happening with the potential reopening of the Strait of Hormuz? I hear so much being said about what is happening, and then nothing ever happens. What gives? When will this end? Well, I assure you that something interesting is happening in the negotiations right now. It may even be apparent in some lines on sea maps. But let me hammer home a few critical central lessons from International Relations 101 before delving into the nuance of what is allegedly being negotiated. Starting with when this will end, I do not know. No one knows. If someone knew, then some of the central bargaining tensions between the two of them would not exist, namely, how long each is willing to hold out. But if the central bargaining tensions between the two did not exist, then we would not be observing this continue at all, and we could all go home happy. Wouldn't that be nice? On that part about hearing so much about what is happening, my best advice is to just turn that off. All of it. Just ignore it. If you are watching cable news and they begin discussing official statements to the press about Iran, then pull out your phone, play a few hands of Balatro, die to the black deck, and then pop back on the news 5 minutes later. You will have missed nothing of relevance. Trying to read the tea leaves on the subject is a fool's errand. Unless you are involved in the financial markets, I can guarantee you that the return on your time will not be worth it. I can sympathize with the cable news network having about 16 hours of content to fill each day. It makes my 8 to 12 minutes per day look quaint by comparison. At the same time, though, I do not think that news organizations should feel an obligation to report on meaningless cheap talk. News is only news if it tells us something new, and levying the same old threats day after day that are the same things that both strong and weak types of states would say is not at all informative. With that being said, the leaks from the negotiations appear to be an interesting attempt from Iran to split Trump from the Western coalition, the Arab coalition, and even his domestic audience. The basics of Iran's proposed plan is for traffic flowing through the reopened strait to follow two lanes. Inbound, ships hug the Iranian coastline. Outbound, they hug the Omani coastline. Then there are various rumors of tolls, service fees, slight modifications of outbound lanes that put ships closer to Iran at the hook in the strait, and more. But the important point remaining is that it would exclude US and Israeli ships from passing through. If something close to that comes into effect, I suspect that it will be labeled as a major strategic defeat for the United States. Because, yeah, on the face of it, it looks like Iran dictated what the United States can and cannot do. But I think that we should spend a moment discussing the practical aspects of it. For one thing, the new routes do not actually give Iran much additional control over the strait as compared to the pre-war status quo. Inbound ships will be much closer to the coast, yes, and often that gets interpreted as them being more vulnerable to Iranian coercion. However, the key thing to remember is that the strait is narrow, as if anyone could ever forget that, and Iran was always able to harass transiting vessels if it wanted to. Iran opted not to because of the wrath it would face by doing so. The only difference between whether ships are close to the coast or out toward the middle is how much fuel Iran has to burn to harass target ships. Either way, the ships are vulnerable. Either way, the chief disincentive is opposing militaries imposing costs on Iran as punishment. Where there is a practical difference here is that a ship in distress would likely be relying on Iranian assistance rather than some other country's rescue fleet. And you could see how that would make some ship owners, and their insurance companies, a little bit nervous. But the bigger discussion needs to be about the US and Israeli bans. And actually, this part is effectively meaningless from a commercial perspective. Israeli ships basically never went out that way beforehand. Very few US flagships did either. So if we stick to the strict interpretation of a US and Israeli ban, this is not much of a practical concession at all. But there are caveats. One, we once again find ourselves having to ask what defines whether a ship belongs to a particular country. Perhaps you remember this fun game from when the Houthis were the big story last year. Or maybe the drama with Venezuela as the calendar was turning. Or the continued issues with tankers carrying Russian crude. Flags are usually terrible indicators of a ship's true nationality. If we start restricting the strait to ships owned by U.S. entities, or worse, ships with U.S. cargo aboard, then this becomes a big deal. No chance that the U.S. Navy would leave rather than continue to fight. Oh, and speaking of the U.S. Navy, that is the other big caveat. U.S. commercial vessels sailing through the strait might not be common, but the Navy is a different story. If they cannot cross, then they cannot reach Saudi Arabia's eastern coast or any part of Kuwait. This is where you venture into the realm of bargaining over objects that influence future bargaining power. And if we learned anything from Ukraine last year, it is that it is very difficult to get such deals to work, because once your enemy is weakened, you can successfully demand more. To keep the rest of our conversation interesting, and avoid me saying the United States would reject that over and over again, let's focus on the case where Iran intends a light version of the ban. Basically, the thing that sounds humiliating on the surface to the United States, but has no practical impact on commercial ships passing through the strait. You can see how this intends to drive a wedge between Trump and those whose support he relies on to continue the conflict. Once implemented, the negative economic consequences of the war will begin to fade away. Both Arab countries and Iran would restart exporting crude from the Gulf. Oil refineries in the region would restart processing the crude that does not leave the Gulf, also easing a separate choke point for consumers. Prices would start to come down across the board, and we could return to the glory days of February 27th, 2026. You can immediately see why Arab countries would find this deal attractive. The bleeding stops, and the green starts to return to the region. You can also see why Western partners would find this attractive. Energy prices come down. Everything becomes cheaper. Windfall profits for Russia's oil export industry vanish, and consumers in the United States would see the same benefits. The problem is that the Trump administration has the final veto in whether the deal is implemented. And that, from a bilateral bargaining perspective, is strange. You are trying to get a deal done with your opponent by making the deal look specifically unattractive for that opponent. The only way to get that to work is if it looks so attractive to the other parties that they impose enough pressure on Trump to accept despite his personal distaste for the deal. And maybe that will work, but there are a few points running against it. One, as just mentioned, Arab countries benefit from having U.S. naval protection. Maybe they care more about the financial situation, but this will still scale down how much pressure they will levy against Trump. Two, and this seemingly needs to be repeated every month, the United States only internalizes a fraction of the costs associated with the war. Everyone who uses fuel is implicitly absorbing the impact of it. So, yes, higher gas prices upset U.S. consumers, but it is much easier to continue the war when everyone in the world is paying an extra $1 per gallon of gas, as opposed to if the United States alone was paying $5 more for a gallon of gas. 3. The U.S. partners in the region cannot force the U.S. blockade to disband. And that is critical because the blockade is now the primary form of U.S. coercion. You might recall that Saudi Arabia had previously halted air operations by prohibiting the United States from using its bases. In contrast, the United States could sustain the blockade without local port support, though it might make the logistics a bit more difficult. And even if just one country stays with the United States, much of that pressure dissipates. Actually, whether anyone is helping at all currently is ambiguous, though there is suspicion that Oman is. Lastly, gas prices have started to trickle down over the last week. You will recall that the biggest chunk of the elevated prices was a lack of refinery capacity, not crude oil. Well, U.S. refineries have started going into overdrive, somewhat mitigating that problem. We can still see that the refineries are the problem because, also over the last week, the crack spread has come down. Put differently, consumers are starting to see some relief. There seems to be a conventional wisdom that Trump needs to get this done before the midterm election. I do not think that is true. The bulk of the political damage has already been done. Judging by how many things he wants to attach his name to, Trump cares a lot about leaving a legacy. The United States squeezed out of the Gulf will live on in memory far longer than any party losses during a midterm election. Again, maybe despite these points a deal gets done. Do not forget at the top that I said that no one really knows what is happening here. But if the conventional wisdom that the United States is powerless here was so obviously true, we would not still be talking about this after 4 months. The US Navy would have just up and left by now. Consequently, we have to hold tight to see where this takes us. Meanwhile, if you click here, you will be instantly taken to the Geopolitics Helpline archive. Could there be a better place to be? And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.